The boarding chime had barely faded when the PA crackled. Security sweep in 7 minutes. Elijah Carter slid his cabin bag into the overhead, the metal ID tag tapping softly against the rail. A sound he'd heard on 100 flights he'd built this airline to fly. Then, a hand clamped onto the handle. "Sir, that's obviously not your bag." The white passenger's stare traveled down Elijah's suit, then back to the luxury leather, like a verdict already delivered. Around them, the aisle tightened, curiosity sharpened. Elijah kept his voice level. "It is my bag." But the man tugged it closer to his chest, as if protecting it from him. A freshman voice from 2 rows back whispered, "I'm streaming this," and a phone rose discreetly. Elijah felt the old sting being treated as an intruder in a space he helped build, while the clock above the galley kept counting down, loud as a second heartbeat. Have you ever watched someone get judged before they even had the chance to speak? Where are you listening from tonight? What city? What country? What seat in the world's big cabin? If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the stories that make us question what we think we know. Now take a breath, because what happens next will push the tension even further. The aisle had barely relaxed from the first shock when the tension thickened again, settling over the premium cabin like a heated fog. Elijah could feel every pair of eyes recalibrating not toward the truth, but toward the story they preferred to believe. The man gripping his bag, Mark Ellison, straightened his blazer as though the posture itself were proof of ownership. "This model costs more than most people make in a month," Mark said, tone floating somewhere between politeness and quiet superiority. "Easy mistake to make. They all look similar. If you don't, shop for them often." The pause lingered like a smirk. A few passengers exchanged glances, subtle, silent nods of alignment. The sort of look people give when they decide which version of reality feels most comfortable. Elijah inhaled slowly, letting the scent of the leather bag ground him. He recognized that tone intimately. It wasn't aggression. It was classification. The sorting of who belonged and who did not, spoken with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to being believed. Behind him, the freshman girl Maya shifted her phone slightly. The red recording dot glowed at the corner of the screen. Her commentary was barely audible, a breath inside the hum of the cabin. People need to see how this plays out. The viewer count blinked up. 112, 184, 236. Elijah ignored the phone and spoke evenly. "The bag is mine. I ordered this model in." A voice from the opposite row cut him off. "It's an easy mix-up," said a woman with perfectly curled hair and a pearl brooch, Sandra Boyd. "These compartments get confusing. Maybe he picked up the wrong one without noticing." Her diplomatic smile didn't reach her eyes. They slipped down Elijah's frame the same way Mark's had, landing on his brown skin, lingering a fraction too long. "It happens," she added, softer. "Especially if you're not used to flying up here." Another coded pause, another message delivered without saying the words. The cabin felt tighter. The overhead lights dimmed to pre-departure warmth, but it only sharpened the edges of the scene. Mark holding the bag protectively, Elijah standing tall yet cornered by assumptions. Sandra offering gracious explanations that weren't gracious at all. Elijah reached for the ID tag. The brushed metal glinted under the cabin lights, displaying his initials, E. Carter, founder. The engraving had a faint scratch, a mark from the early days when he moved equipment himself, because the airline he was building didn't yet have a staff. It was a detail no imitator would bother replicating. He held it up just enough for them to see. "This tag," he said, voice calm, "has been with me since the first aircraft we commissioned. The bag is mine." But instead of softening, Mark's expression hardened with permission, the kind people grant themselves when a crowd silently affirms their bias. "Anyone could get a fake tag engraved," he replied. "Luxury markets are full of knockoffs." Sandra nodded sympathetically, as if Elijah were the one causing a scene by insisting on his own truth. "You don't need to be defensive, sir. We're just trying to keep everyone's belongings safe." The implication stung more than the words. Safe, as if Elijah were the threat. Maya zoomed in discreetly, capturing the micro-expressions: disbelief on Elijah's face, entitlement on Mark's, the patronizing softness on Sandra's. Viewer count surged past 300. "Chat's saying to show the lining," Maya whispered to no one specifically. "Apparently this brand has a custom stitch pattern." Mark beat Elijah to it. He yanked the zipper halfway open, not enough to reveal ownership, just enough to assert control. "This lining," he declared, "is exclusive to this year's release. I would know." Elijah's jaw tightened. That detail was wrong, fatally wrong, but he bit back the correction. Anything he said now would sound like a contest he never consented to enter. And the more calmly he spoke, the more they would interpret his restraint as uncertainty. "Please don't open my bag," he said quietly. Mark scoffed. "If it's yours, you shouldn't mind confirming." Sandra lifted her chin. "He's being reasonable. You're escalating this." Elijah turned slightly, just enough to see crew members approaching. Their nervous smiles carried a different message. "We don't want to get involved yet." Their eyes darted between the passengers, seeking the path of least resistance. The power dynamic shifted again, not because anyone held authority, but because everyone assumed they did. Elijah felt the familiar ache under his ribs, the emotional memory of every room where he had been questioned before being welcomed, every negotiation where he'd needed to prove expertise before being granted competence, every gate agent who'd asked twice for his ID, while waving others through with a glance. He wasn't angry. Anger would have given them a story that fit too easily. He was tired. "I know what belongs to me," he said softly. A murmur rippled through the rows. Not agreement, just the acknowledgement of tension thickening, like pressurizing air before takeoff. Maya's camera caught the tremor of the ID tag as Elijah lowered his hand. The motif returned, small but insistent, a symbol of identity ignored, dismissed, doubted. More viewers flooded in. 412, 527, 603. Mark raised the bag slightly, a gesture that bordered on theatrical. "We'll let the crew sort this out," he said. "They know how to handle these misunderstandings." It wasn't said cruelly, but it didn't need to be. The condescension was baked into the syllables. Elijah exhaled, steady and contained. He felt the boarding clock ticking beside his heartbeat. He noticed the faint scent of cedar polish rising from the bag, his bag. The texture of its handle warming under the cabin lights, the presence of something he'd earned being treated as something he'd stolen. The cabin lights dimmed another notch, settling into the warm gold hue meant to soothe passengers before departure, yet it only highlighted how tightly the air was drawn around Elijah. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one, each thud punctuating the rising tension. Near the galley, a soft chime signaled another pre-flight check, blending into the background of the woman's voice over the PA. "Security sweep commencing in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. It sounded shorter aloud than it did in his head. Sandra Boyd shifted forward in her seat, hands folded elegantly over her designer tote. Her voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone used to being deferred to. "Sir," she said to Elijah, tilting her head the way a teacher might to an unruly student, "you're clearly upset, but getting emotional won't help. Let's all stay calm." It was astonishing, Elijah thought, how people could mistake composure for instability simply because they'd already assigned a narrative to you. His breathing hadn't changed, his voice hadn't risen. Yet here was a stranger lecturing him on self-control. Mark leaned into the moment, emboldened. "Yeah, man," he echoed. "Let the crew handle it. No need to escalate." He said man the way someone might say buddy or kid, a casual diminishment. Elijah kept his gaze steady. "I'm not escalating anything." But the words didn't land the way he meant them to. Behind them, Maya's phone vibrated with the force of surging notifications. Her livestream viewer count leapt so quickly the numbers blurred. 2,147, 3,022, 4,308, 5,001. Chat bubbles flooded the screen. "He's calm, you all are projecting." "Show the tag again." That woman's tone, though. This is bias 101. Maya swallowed, steadying her hand. She hadn't meant for the situation to go viral, but the more she recorded, the more she felt responsible for not looking away. Up front, 2 flight attendants approached, exchanging uneasy glances. The junior crew member, Adam, gave a tiny, apologetic smile, then pretended to check the seat numbers on the opposite side of the aisle. Chloe, the lead FA, hovered a step behind him, palms pressed together in a silent "please don't make me choose yet." They were close enough to intervene, but not close enough to matter. Institutional hesitation, one of the most suffocating forms of bias, not malicious, just cowardly. Elijah lifted a hand from the overhead rail, steady but tense. "May I finish my sentence from earlier?" "I was explaining the bag." Sandra cut him off again, smiling in a way that felt like soft velvet covering sharpened claws. "We understand you believe it's yours, but the gentleman here is simply trying to protect his property. There's no need to take it personally." Believe, as if Elijah's claim were a matter of imagination. He felt the sting more sharply this time, not because of her words, but because of the choreography around them, the nods, the avoidance, the silent approval. The cabin had subtly chosen its protagonist, and it wasn't him. Elijah glanced toward the overhead panel. The seatbelt signs pulsed softly. Under their glow, he saw the ID tag on his bag swinging from the slight turbulence of shifting weight around them. The brushed metal winked as the plane's ventilation hummed overhead. His initials, his history, his airline. And yet, in this moment, it might as well have been a counterfeit charm. "Look," Mark said, adjusting his grip on the bag in a way that was almost performative. "Nobody's accusing you of anything. But this is a high-end item. Mistakes like this can get messy. Calm cooperation is the best approach." Elijah felt the phrase pierce deeper than intended. Calm cooperation. A familiar directive. He'd heard versions of it in boardrooms, in investor meetings, at customs checkpoints where officials looked twice at his passport but once at everyone else's. It was the language of those who believed they were being reasonable while asking him to shrink until he fit their comfort. "I am calm," Elijah said. His voice carried the quiet firmness of a man who had built an empire one sacrifice at a time. But Sandra exhaled with exaggerated patience, as though soothing a tantrum. "Then please show that you are." Confusion flickered across the faces of nearby passengers, not because they disagreed with her, but because they believed her framing. If she felt he was on the edge, that meant he must be. Maya zoomed in, capturing the moment Elijah's composure became misinterpreted restraint, a dangerous alchemy of gendered and racial assumptions that transformed trauma into threat. "Chat wants to know why she's talking to him like he's a child," Maya murmured. Elijah heard her. Oddly, the validation didn't soothe. It magnified the surrealism of the moment. He was simultaneously misjudged in real time and understood by strangers miles away. He took a slow breath. The scent of eucalyptus from Chloe's uniform drifted into the air, blending with the cool sterility of circulating cabin oxygen. The heating vent above him clicked, a tiny mechanical tick marking the passage of dwindling minutes. He turned, trying once more to de-escalate. "All I want is for you to stop opening my—" "Sir," Sandra said sharply, "please lower your voice." His voice wasn't raised. The reprimand struck like a slap made of silk. The aisle seemed to narrow. His spine straightened instinctively, though he wished more than anything he could sit. But standing meant being visible, and visibility right now was volatile. Mark lifted the bag again. Half an inch. Enough to claim symbolic possession. "We're all just trying to help." Elijah blinked once, slowly. He felt the pressure rising against the thin membrane of his patience, the urge to reclaim what was his, to assert authority not with force but with fact. But anything he did, any gesture larger than a breath, could be reframed as aggression. He placed one hand lightly on the rail beside him, grounding himself. The metal was cool, real, unlike the shifting story, being built around him. "I know exactly how this looks," he said quietly. Behind him, Maya whispered to her phone, "And that's the problem." The timer in the cabin display ticked down another minute. 4 left. And the injustice was only gaining speed. For a moment, the cabin seemed to pause, not because the tension eased, but because every person in the aisle realized they had pushed the scene as far as they comfortably could. The argument had reached a point where escalation felt dangerous, yet retreat felt like losing face. In that fragile space, silence gathered like a thin membrane stretching across the rows. Elijah stepped back half a foot, not in surrender but in reclamation of breath. He needed space, not physical but emotional, to stop himself from becoming the man they imagined. His lungs filled slowly, deliberately. The air was cooler here near the vent, carrying a faint hint of citrus from someone's travel hand cream. He let the sense anchor him. He let the moment slow. He had learned, long ago, that survival sometimes meant taking 2 seconds nobody wanted to give you. Maya noticed the shift. Her camera lowered just slightly, not enough to stop recording, but enough to acknowledge the human being at the center of the storm. Even through the lens, she could sense it. Elijah wasn't retreating. He was recalibrating. Mark misread the pause. "Finally," he muttered, loosening his grip on the bag. "He's calming down." Calming down. The phrase stung, but Elijah let it drift past him like exhaust. He touched the ID tag with his thumb. The engraved metal was warm now, having absorbed the heat of his palm. That tag had traveled with him through negotiations, inaugural flights, and fundraising meetings where he'd had to convince rooms full of people that a black founder could build an airline worth investing in. Each scratch on its surface was a chapter, not a flaw. He rolled the tag gently between his fingers, a private gesture, invisible to the cabin, meant only to steady his heartbeat. He did not look at Mark. He did not look at Sandra. He looked at the bag. His bag, and then briefly at his own reflection in the glossy trim of the overhead hatch, eyes steady, posture upright, a man who had learned to wear authority without needing to announce it. "This," he reminded himself, "is who I am." A middle-aged man, 2 rows up, shifted in his seat. The discomfort on his face wasn't with Elijah, it was with the situation. He cleared his throat, then stopped, then opened his mouth again as if searching for a sentence brave enough to cross the aisle. None came. He lowered his gaze to his tablet. Breathing space, even when offered unconsciously, was contagious. A soft creak came from the aisle floor as Chloe, the lead flight attendant, stepped closer. Her voice was measured. "Sir," she said to Elijah, "would you mind stepping just a bit to the side while we assess?" Assess, not resolve. She wasn't siding with him, but she wasn't dismissing him either. Elijah nodded. "I'll give you room." His willingness surprised her. It surprised Mark too, who seemed suddenly unsure how to interpret a black man who neither obeyed nor rebelled, who simply held his dignity without theatrics. As Chloe repositioned herself, Elijah caught the reflection of the ID tag once more. The motif shimmered in that brief interval like a heartbeat, under light, quiet, insistent, loyal. Maya whispered into her mic, "He's the calmest person here." A flood of hearts surged up the livestream screen. The viewer count jumped past 7,000. Mark watched the camera nervously now, not fully aware of how wide the audience had grown. His face tightened. He wasn't the villain in his own mind, just a man acting out of instinct, but the lens had no patience for nuance. "Listen," Mark said to Chloe, "we all know these luxury items are easy to mix up. I've flown first class for years. I know this model inside out." Elijah closed his eyes, not in frustration, but in exhaustion. He didn't need to win this man over. He didn't need to play the role of educator today. He only needed to hold on to the truth without letting them twist him into something unrecognizable. Sandra chimed in again, softer this time. "He's probably embarrassed. We should all just give him space." The words, though patronizing, contained the faintest tremor of reconsideration, as if some part of her was beginning to question her certainty. A seed of doubt was sprouting in the cabin. It wasn't loyalty to Elijah, not yet. It was the uncomfortable sense that the assumptions they had made might not hold. And Elijah felt it. He remained quiet, not out of fear, but because the stillness gave gravity to his presence. His silence pulled the cabin inward, forcing them to sit with the weight of their actions. Chloe cleared her throat. "Let's proceed carefully. Sir Mark, if we could just—" Elijah raised a hand gently. "You can take your time," he said. The softness of his tone carried farther than he intended. It wasn't submissive, it was gracious. It was the grace of someone who understood that his calm was the only thing preventing the situation from collapsing into chaos. The cabin noticed that, too. Maya caught his expression through her lens, a man holding himself together not to avoid being feared, but to avoid being misread, a man weighted by expectations he never asked to carry. Her voice cracked as she narrated quietly. "How is he the only one being patient right now?" The words struck the cabin more sharply than any accusation. Even Sandra lowered her gaze. For the first time since the confrontation began, the emotional tide shifted not toward justice, not yet, but toward recognition. Recognition of Elijah's humanity, his restraint, his exhaustion. A bridge was forming. A fragile one. And as the plane hummed softly around him, Elijah rested his fingertips on the ID tag once more, its warmth grounding him. A reminder of who he was, and who he refused to become. In the face of diminishing eyes, for a heartbeat, the small bridge of empathy held. But like all fragile structures built under pressure, it cracked the moment someone leaned on it too hard. Mark adjusted his stance, stepping slightly into Elijah's personal space, lifting the bag with a casual confidence that felt rehearsed. The leather handles creaked softly as he raised them, an insignificant sound to anyone else, but to Elijah it was the sound of someone tightening their grip on a narrative that didn't belong to them. "So," Mark said, voice loud enough to claim authority, "let's be practical. This specific model," he tapped the side of the bag, "was released with the 2023 collection. Very limited, very recognizable. People who actually buy these understand the difference." There it was, the full weight of class bias disguised as expertise. Sandra, still perched elegantly in her seat, added, "Yes, it's a hard truth. Luxury requires familiarity. Not everyone is used to these details." Her tone softened at the end, like she was offering Elijah a polite exit from a room he'd never been invited into. But Elijah caught the slip, the way she unconsciously pressed her palm against her pearls, as though reaffirming her own belonging while questioning his. The livestream chat erupted. "Did she really say that?" He literally hasn't raised his voice once. "This is straight-up profiling. That's not the 2023 lining." Maya swallowed hard. Her viewer count spiked to 12,000. Elijah kept his hands visible. Fingers relaxed on the metal rail beside him. The cabin around him tightened, the narrow aisle suddenly claustrophobic, the overhead lights dimming again as the aircraft systems prepared for security sweep. A muffled thud sounded from the cargo loading area beneath them. The vibration traveled through the flooring and into his shoes. Chloe, the lead FA, stepped forward. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Uncertainty flickered in her posture. She glanced at Adam, who avoided eye contact like touching the wrong decision might burn him. Institutional bias didn't need to be spoken. It lived in hesitation. "Sir," Chloe finally said, addressing Elijah with careful diction, "we are trying to verify ownership. Please allow us to process this step by step." "I have allowed exactly that," Elijah replied quietly. "All I've done is stand here." Sandra let out a dramatic sigh. "You see? He's getting defensive again." Defensive. A word that rewrites the truth without touching it. Elijah felt heat rise in his chest, not anger, but the intensity of containment. Holding himself together required effort measured in micro-movements, slowing his breath, relaxing his jaw, unclenching the fist he hadn't realized he'd formed. His restraint was not weakness. It was labor. Meanwhile, Mark's confidence grew. "If we unzip just a little further," he said, fingers traveling back to the zipper, "we'll know the truth immediately." "No," Elijah said, more firmly than before. "You will not open my bag." Gasps fluttered through the cabin, not because his tone was harsh, because he had finally set a boundary. And boundaries, when coming from someone others expect to tolerate disrespect, always sound louder than intended. Mark seized the moment. "This is exactly what I mean," he told the cabin. Anyone with nothing to hide would cooperate. Elijah's heartbeat spiked. Not from fear, but from recognition. This argument, this framing, had been used on him before, at security checkpoints, at business negotiations, where he'd been mistaken for an assistant, at investor meetings, where people assumed the white man on his team was the founder. He could predict every sentence Mark would say next. He could predict every silence the bystanders would keep. His hand brushed against the ID tag again. The engraved letters, E. Carter Founder, caught the warm cabin light. He felt the scratch under his fingertip, the one from the first aircraft engine inspection he'd ever done himself. This airline existed because of that man, because of him. Yet here, right now, he was being treated as an imposter inside his own creation. "Elijah?" Chloe asked, more softly. "We need cooperation from both sides. We can't—" He cut in, voice level but deeply anchored. "I have cooperated." Sandra folded her arms. "He's making this harder than it needs to be." Maya's camera zoomed in on Elijah's face, the controlled breath, the hurt in his eyes, the poise under pressure. Chat erupted again. "He's outnumbered. This is painful to watch. He's literally the only calm person here. They're bullying him in premium." Elijah heard a faint tremble in the air, the low murmur of passengers beginning to feel something new, doubt. The certainty they'd initially had in Mark's narrative was faltering. But before the tide could shift fully, Mark delivered the line. "Why would a man like you fly with a bag like this?" "A man like you." The words hit Elijah with the force of a slap made entirely of implication, race, class, gender, all condensed into 8 syllables delivered softly enough to be socially acceptable and sharp enough to cut through bone. The cabin froze. Even the hum of ventilation seemed to hush, as though the aircraft itself had flinched. Mark didn't realize what he'd revealed, but Elijah did. Maya did. 12,000 viewers did. Elijah's breath caught not in panic, but in recognition. This was the moment. He lifted his eyes and met Mark's stare head-on, not with anger, but with a clarity that seemed to widen the space around him. "That," Elijah said quietly, "is the question you should be asking yourself." Even Chloe blinked. Even Sandra's confidence wavered. For the first time, the cabin saw the ugliness for what it was. And the descent into public accountability was now inevitable. The aircraft vibrated softly as the jet bridge began retracting, the distant machinery thumping like a second heartbeat beneath the flooring. A chime rang overhead sharp, clinical, and the PA crackled with a voice that sliced through the cabin. "Security personnel are approaching the aircraft. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Enough time for everything to collapse, and not nearly enough time for truth to surface." Elijah felt the shift instantly. It moved through the rows like cold air, passengers straightening up, crew members stiffening, Mark's confidence sharpening, Sandra retreating into dignified silence. Nothing had been resolved, yet the stakes had risen so abruptly that the cabin seemed to tilt toward panic. Maya's phone buzzed violently in her hands. The livestream number jumped 13,212, 15,904, 20,113. Her whisper trembled. "It's going viral." The digital chorus of thousands hovered invisibly above the aisle, witnessing everything yet powerless to intervene. Chloe exhaled shakily. "Okay, everyone, remain seated. We need to let security assess the situation." But the word "assess" again landed like a judgment already skewed. Elijah heard the fear in her tone, not fear of him, but of mishandling a policy, of the punishment that came when a crew member backed the wrong person. "Sir," Chloe said to Mark, "please put the bag down until security arrives." Mark didn't move. His grip tightened. his chin lifting almost imperceptibly, as if letting go now would mean losing the argument entirely. "I'm trying to protect my property," he said pointedly. "His property." The phrase recomposed the entire scene around his assumption. Elijah straightened, calm but taut. "Your property? On what basis?" Mark gestured to the bag. "I recognize it." "You recognize the 2023 lining," Elijah replied quietly. "This model isn't from 2023. Maya's camera caught the flick of tension across Mark's face, the first visible crack. Chad exploded. He caught him. "Mark looks nervous. Check the year. Check the year. GSM. System glitch? Or Mark lying?" The sudden shift made the energy wobble, the moral axis tilting slightly toward Elijah. But only slightly. Adam, the junior flight attendant, swallowed hard. "We, tried scanning the tag, but the system didn't match the serial." Elijah turned to him. "Did it mismatch, or did it say incomplete?" Adam froze. He hadn't expected to be questioned. Incomplete." Maya zoomed in. "Incomplete means what?" she asked her viewers. Chat answered faster than thought. "Means the system didn't fetch full data. Sometimes happens with founder-tier items. Glitch in premium registry. My dad works airline maintenance." Elijah didn't smile. He simply nodded once. "I know." The ID tag dangled just inches from Chloe's hand. She glanced at it, at the engraved initials, the scratch, the aged metal, but institutional training overrode intuition. "We still need security to verify." Mark seized the moment. "Exactly. Let's all relax and let the professionals handle it." Relax. As if Elijah were the chaotic one. The cabin air felt heavy now, thick with recycled oxygen, and the unspoken fear that something irreversible was about to happen. Outside, through the cracked window shade, the vague silhouette of uniformed security approached the jet bridge door. 2 minutes had become seconds. Mark stepped closer again, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm sure you think this is your bag, but if we're wrong, this whole flight gets delayed for nothing." "If you're wrong," Elijah corrected gently, "the damage will be to more than a schedule." Mark's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected quiet defiance. Quiet defiance made him look unreasonable. The live stream surged again, 22K, 24K, 27K. Passengers shifted, whispering. A man near row 3 leaned toward his partner. He might actually be telling the truth. His partner whispered back, "Then why wouldn't the crew clear it?" "Policy," he said. "Nobody wants to touch this." Yes, policy was the new antagonist. Elijah felt it like a wall rising around him, not built by malice, but by fear of liability. He could almost see the algorithms, the decision trees, the corporate memos, flitting invisibly through the minds of the crew. If uncertain, defer. If threatened, escalate. If public, minimize risk. But minimize risk to whom? Chloe's voice softened. "Sir, Elijah, if security finds inconsistency, they may need to remove both of you until proper verification." Maya gasped in a whisper. "Both? Why both?" Mark looked smug again. Elijah inhaled through his nose, slow, steady. He felt the tiny shift of aircraft pressure in his sinuses as the external door sealed. The soft hiss of air circulation was the only thing keeping the moment from collapsing. "Let me say this clearly," Elijah said, without raising his voice. "I have cooperated. I have not touched him. I have not raised my voice. And I have not obstructed any crew member. You cannot pretend otherwise." His restraint radiated dignity so palpable that even passengers who had doubted him felt the weight of it now. But the system didn't. The system only recognized procedures. Maya whispered to her phone. If he had yelled once, they'd use that against him. But him staying calm, they're still using that too. Her viewers answered in a flood. That's how bias works. Damn, this is painful to watch. Security's gonna believe the white guy. Please, let someone speak up." The anticipation grew thick enough to taste. Then, footsteps on the jet bridge. Firm, echoing, getting closer. Chloe straightened. Adam froze. Mark lifted his chin. Sandra smoothed her skirt. Maya steadied her camera. Elijah squared his shoulders. The moment stretched like a wire pulled to breaking. Security was seconds away, and the truth had nowhere left to hide. The jet bridge door hissed open. 2 security officers stepped inside, one tall with a clipped stride, the other scanning the cabin with crisp, impersonal efficiency. Their radios crackled softly, punctuating the air like static warnings. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees as the presence of authority filled the aisle. Maya's phone vibrated violently in her hands. 33,000, 41,000, 52,000 viewers. The surge was so fast, her screen lagged. The first officer spoke. "We have a reported property dispute. Everyone remain seated." Mark straightened instantly, shoulders lifting as though someone had handed him a crown. "Yes, officer," he said, gesturing toward the bag still clamped under his hand. "This gentleman," the word dipped disdainfully, "took my bag by mistake and is refusing to return it." The officer turned to Elijah. No hostility, just a tired, bureaucratic neutrality that felt colder than aggression. "Sir, is that correct?" "No," Elijah replied calmly. "It's my bag." The officer extended a hand. "May I see it?" Elijah nodded. "Of course." But Mark was faster. He lifted the bag toward the officer with theatrical helpfulness. "I've been trying to cooperate this whole time." A few passengers shifted, uncomfortable with the performance. Elijah caught the flicker in their eyes, but didn't cling to it. He had learned long ago not to expect rescue from silence. The officer unzipped the bag halfway. "We'll check identifying markers." Elijah inhaled. "Please be careful with quote." Mark cut him off. "Officer, look at the stitching. This is the 2023 pattern." The officer paused. "This appears older than 2023. Maya zoomed in on the moment, her breath catching. Chat exploded. Security caught it. "Old lining." Mark lied. "Let him speak." Mark's face flushed, but pride kept him anchored. "Sir, I know these models. I own 2. The first officer ignored him and lifted the ID tag. The engraved letters E, Carter Founder, shimmered under his flashlight. A faint scratch caught the beam. A detail that belonged only to Elijah's life. The officer's brow furrowed. "This tag, where did you obtain it?" Elijah's answer was simple. "It's mine. Can you confirm the serial number?" "I can," Elijah said quietly, "but your system won't match it. Founder tier luggage isn't in your registry." The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll run it anyway." They scanned it. A soft beep, then text flashed across their device. "Incomplete data refer to manufacturer." Mark seized the opening, relief sweeping over him like sudden oxygen. "You see? Nothing confirms his story. That tag could have come from anywhere." Elijah's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the exhaustion of being proven truthful, yet still treated as questionable. Chloe stepped forward, voice trembling. "Officers, he has been calm and compliant. I just want to make that clear." It was the closest she'd come to defending him, but it wasn't enough to counter institutional inertia. "We'll need both of you to accompany us off the aircraft," the officer said carefully, "until we can verify ownership through extended protocols." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Both. The word hit harder than any accusation. It meant innocence wasn't relevant. It meant procedure overrode reality. It meant dignity could be confiscated as easily as luggage. Maya clapped a hand over her mouth. "No, no, no," she whispered. The live stream count spiked 58K, 63K, 70K. Hearts and angry emojis flooded the feed. "Both? That's insane. He's literally done nothing. This is institutional bias happening live." Elijah closed his eyes. Only for a second. just long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle on him, not rage, but the deep, bone-heavy familiarity of being punished for someone else's fear. He opened them again and found Maya looking at him. Not with pity, pity was useless, but with a grief he recognized. Grief for a system that kept repeating itself. "Elijah?" Chloe murmured, stepping closer. I'm sorry. This is procedure." He nodded. "I know." Mark exhaled triumphantly, as though vindicated. "Let's get this sorted properly." But passengers began murmuring real murmurs now, not polite observations. Doubt broke out like cracks in dry earth. "That doesn't seem right. He's been calm the whole time. Why are they taking him? Shouldn't they check the details again?" The officers ignored them. Elijah Carter, the taller one, read from his device. "You'll need to—" He stopped, because the name he had just spoken matched. The tag in his hand. The cabin inhaled collectively. Mark paled. Sandra stiffened. Chloe's eyes widened. Maya whispered, "Oh my God." The officer looked up at Elijah, not with apology yet, but with dawning confusion. "You're Elijah Carter?" Elijah met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Yes." And suddenly the entire cabin understood the stakes. Security was seconds from escorting the CEO of the airline off his own aircraft, because no one could imagine he belonged there. For a suspended second, no one breathed. The officer's voice still hung in the air. "You're Elijah Carter?" As if saying the name out loud had disrupted the gravitational field of the cabin. A soft ding sounded overhead, the seatbelt sign flickering, but no one looked. Every eye was locked on the man who had just been nearly escorted off his own aircraft. Mark's face drained of color. Sandra's hand froze mid-adjustment on her pearls. Chloe blinked twice, her throat tightening around a gasp she didn't release. And Elijah, who had endured humiliation, tone policing, class suspicion, and institutional paralysis, stood absolutely still, shoulders squared, not in pride, but in a kind of weary resolve. His silence was no longer misinterpreted as defensiveness. It felt like a mirror held up to everyone else's actions. Then, the murmurs began. A man in row 3 whispered, "Wait, Carter? The Carter?" Someone behind him murmured, "He built this airline." Another voice, sharper, "They were about to drag him out." Elijah lowered his eyes, not in shame, in disappointment, the kind that hollowed the chest. Mark swallowed hard. I didn't know. But that was the problem, and everyone knew it. He hadn't needed to know. He had assumed. The air didn't move. Even the ventilation system seemed to hesitate. And then Maya stepped forward. Not with authority, not with entitlement, but with something far more dangerous to injustice. Moral clarity. Her hand trembled as she held up her phone. Livestream still roaring at 83,000 viewers. "Sir," she said to Mark, but loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "The tag literally has his name on it. You kept insisting he stole it. Are you sure it wasn't your assumptions doing the talking?" The sentence sliced through the aisle like a blade dipped in truth. Mark's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Whatever defense he might have had dissolved under the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching him fumble for moral ground. Sandra shrank into her seat, clutching her tote. The pearls no longer looked elegant. They looked like a shield made of denial. The officer cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the audience beyond the cabin. "We need to reassess." But Maya wasn't done. The fire inside her quiet until now burned through her fear. "You told the crew he was escalating," she said, voice cracking but steady. "But he didn't raise his voice once. He didn't touch you. He didn't touch the bag. He only asked not to have his property opened without consent. Everything escalated because you assumed he couldn't own something this expensive." Her voice grew louder, not angry, just impossibly honest. "And the rest of you?" Her eyes swept across the cabin, and heads ducked reflexively. You let it happen. Nobody questioned it. You all let it feel normal. Passengers shifted, guilt pooling across the rows like spilled light. A woman from row 5 spoke, soft as tissue paper. I thought he might be right. I didn't think. A man added, we should have asked for proof from both sides. Another whispered, I just didn't want to get involved. Maya shook her head. But it was already involving you. Bias always does, even when you pretend it doesn't. Elijah's breath hitched barely noticeable, but Maya caught it. He looked tired, ruptured, as though her words had touched a bruise deeper than she meant to expose. Mark finally found a sound half-breath, half-excuse. I wasn't trying to be racist. Elijah closed his eyes. That sentence, he had heard it more times than he could count. It was never a balm, only an admission of guilt trying to disguise itself as innocence. When he opened his eyes again, the final fracture happened. Not in anger, in grief. Do you know, Elijah said softly, how many times people have told me that, right before or right after they question what I own, what I built, or why I'm standing where I'm standing. The cabin froze. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. I don't need you to be a villain, he continued, but I do need you to acknowledge what you saw when you looked at me, and what you didn't see. The officer swallowed hard. Chloe's eyes shimmered. Adam stared at the floor. Mark's throat bobbed. I made a mistake. Maya stepped closer, not threatening, but unyielding. You made an assumption, she corrected, and then you defended it. That's the difference. Her phone buzzed. 91,000 viewers. The cabin was no longer a space. It was a courtroom, a confessional, a mirror. And at the center of it, Elijah Carter finally felt something inside him crack, not breaking him, but exhausting him to the point of collapse. His hand slipped from the overhead rail, fingers trembling for the first time, not out of fear. Out of the weight of being disproven only after nearly being removed from a plane he owned. The officer inhaled slowly, as if bracing himself for what came next. Mr. Carter, he began, voice softer now. We need to talk, privately. But before anyone moved, the cabin existed in a suspended moment of collective guilt. Everyone realizing they had participated, some loudly, some silently, but all undeniably. The officer's voice fractured the silence. Mr. Carter, may we speak with you privately? But there was nothing private about the moment. Not with 90,000 strangers watching. Not with a cabin full of people who had just seen themselves reflected in a very unflattering light. Elijah exhaled slowly. His shoulders sagged, not dramatically, but with the subtle collapse of a man who had held himself together for far too long. The fatigue wasn't just physical, it was generational. His hand slid from the rail, hovering unsteadily before he let it fall to his side. Maya lowered her phone, as if recording this part felt too intimate. The officer stepped closer, holding the half-open bag and tag. Mr. Carter, we reviewed additional logs. The registration discrepancy is consistent with... Elijah cut him off softly. With founder-tier luggage. Yes, I told you. There wasn't anger in his tone. Just exhaustion so real it quieted the entire row. Mark's lips parted. He looked at Elijah not as a threat, not as a trespasser, but as a man whose silence suddenly terrified him more than any accusation. Mark swallowed. I didn't know who you were. Elijah didn't look at him. You didn't need to know who I was to believe the bag was mine. A quiet tremor crossed Mark's face, as if the truth had been waiting behind his ribs, pounding to get out. My father, he said abruptly, voice cracking in the middle, was never treated like he belonged anywhere either. The words broke irregularly, jagged. No one expected it, including Mark himself. The officer paused. Maya froze. Sandra turned her head, stunned. Even Chloe stopped breathing. Mark kept going, the confession spilling before he could restrain it. He was mixed. People questioned him constantly. At airports, at stores, they always asked him to prove what he owned. And when I got older, Mark's breath shook. I swore I'd never let anyone take advantage of me the way they took advantage of him. Elijah finally turned his head. Mark looked nothing like the swaggering passenger from 5 minutes earlier. His bravado had drained away, leaving behind a frightened son, someone who had inherited a wound, then weaponized it without realizing. I wasn't trying to be hostile, Mark whispered. I was trying to protect myself, the way he never could. A crack traveled through Elijah's expression, not sympathy yet, but recognition, because he knew that pain. He had lived its mirror image. Elijah's voice was low. Your father was challenged for not fitting someone else's idea of who belongs, and you turned that fear into vigilance. Mark blinked hard. Yes. And today, Elijah said, you used it on me. The cabin held its collective breath. Not a confrontation. Not an accusation. Simply a truth, spoken plainly. Mark's eyes glistened. I'm so sorry. For a moment, Elijah's guard dropped entirely. His chest tightened, a knot forming at the base of his throat, an ache he had denied for years. Not from Mark's apology, but from his confession. Because bias wasn't born from monsters, it was born from wounds. He steadied himself on the back of a seat. The officer lowered the bag to the floor gently, as though afraid to interrupt the moment. Mr. Carter, we owe you an apology as well. Our process failed to account for— It's not just your process, Elijah said quietly. It's the assumptions behind it. His fingers grazed the ID tag, warm now, shaped by decades of use. It shimmered faintly in the dim cabin light, reflecting both men's faces in its small, curved surface. Maya lifted her phone again, but this time her frame was wide, capturing Elijah and Mark at the same height, sharing the same trembling silence. You asked why a man like me would fly with a bag like this, Elijah said. Mark winced, cheeks burning. But the real question is— Elijah continued, gentler than anyone expected. Why you thought that question made sense. Mark nodded, tears forming. I see that now. Elijah's shoulders softened. Not forgiveness, but release. You weren't the only one, Elijah said, glancing at the cabin. And several passengers lowered their eyes in shame. Sandra wiped at her cheek with a trembling hand. We all jumped to conclusions. Maya whispered, this is what shared guilt looks like. And she was right. This wasn't just Mark's wound. Or Elijah's. It was everyone's, a collision of inherited fears and silent assumptions. The officer cleared his throat, voice newly subdued.
Mr. Carter, what would you like us to do next?
Elijah closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Inside that darkness, he felt the echo of every past humiliation, every misjudgment, every time he'd had to stand taller just to be seen clearly. When he opened them, his voice was steady. Let's finish this properly, he said. All of us. The cabin breathed out all at once, as if the entire aircraft had been holding its lungs hostage through the storm. The tension thinned, not gone, but loosening like a knot, finally admitting it had been pulled too tight. Security stepped back first. Their body language shifted from command to contrition. The taller officer cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we owe you an apology. Our verification protocols clearly weren't designed to handle founder tier identification. We will be filing an immediate report. Chloe blinked, almost startled that someone in uniform had said the words out loud. Yes, the second officer added, we'll recommend an urgent audit on bias escalation procedures, effective immediately. A systemic echo. Not a Band-Aid apology, real change spoken into existence. Chloe placed a hand over her chest, breathing out relief and shame in equal measure. Sir, Elijah, we should have recognized the signs earlier. We should have trusted your calm, not misread it. Elijah looked at her gently. I know your job puts you in impossible positions. I don't blame you. Just don't let silence make the decision next time. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. It won't. Around the cabin, passengers began to exhale their guilt into clumsy, human sentences. A man in row 3 stood halfway, unsure if he should bow or apologize. We misjudged, all of us. Sandra, still clutching her pearls, whispered, "I'm sorry. I truly thought I was helping. I didn't realize," her voice cracked. "I didn't realize how much I assumed." Elijah offered a small nod, not absolution, but acknowledgement. Mark stepped forward last. The arrogance had drained out of him entirely, replaced by something raw and unpolished. "Mr. Carter, Elijah, I'm so deeply sorry," he swallowed. "I let my fear become my instinct, and I hurt you in the process." Elijah watched him with a calm that carried the weight of a lifetime navigating precisely these moments. "Fear is understandable," he said, "but we're responsible for what we do with it." Mark's voice wavered. "I know." For the first time, no one interrupted. No one filled the silence. It was the cleanest silence of the entire ordeal, a silence with room for truth, not denial. The officers returned the bag to Elijah with both hands, almost ceremonially. The leather gleamed once under the cabin lights as he accepted it. When he touched the ID tag, it swung forward gently, catching the faintest glint of gold. A motif reborn. Not a symbol of suspicion, but of reclamation. Maya lowered her phone, ending the live stream with a trembling thumb. Her eyes were bright with empathy, not adrenaline now. "I think people needed to see this," she murmured. "But I'm glad the last part is just for us." Elijah nodded. "Some moments don't need a witness." He stepped aside from the aisle, letting the cabin recalibrate. Passengers returned to their seats, slower this time, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile moral equilibrium that had finally settled. Chloe approached gently. "Mr. Carter, would you like a moment before we resume departure?" He smiled faintly. "Just a second." He moved toward the window, away from the cluster of eyes, letting the last threads of tension unwind in private. The night outside the aircraft was calm, runway lights flickering like distant constellations. The reflection in the window showed a man tired, but standing taller than when the conflict began. His fingers rested on the ID tag, tracing the familiar scratch. A whole career in one flawed piece of metal. A whole life in one contested moment. He whispered, so softly the glass barely carried it. "It was mine the whole time." Not spoken to the cabin. Not spoken to Mark. Not spoken to the world. Spoken to himself. A promise. A truth. A reclamation. Behind him, the cabin lights brightened. Security stepped off. Chloe announced pre-departure procedures with steadier breath. Maya wiped her eyes. Mark sank into his seat, humbled, contemplative. And Elijah turned away from the window, the echo line still warm inside his chest, ready to take the flight forward. Not as a man wronged, but as a man restored. How did this story sit with you? What moments struck, challenged, or surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. Your perspective matters here. And if this episode made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can join these conversations about empathy, bias, and justice. Let's keep the dialogue alive.